All right, good morning and good evening. A warm virtual welcome from the Marron Institute of Urban Management at New York University. I'm Angela Hawken, the director of the NYU Marron Institute. We're delighted that you're attending today. This is the third in the Anatomy of Density webinar series led by Dr. Solly Angel. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the NYU Marron Institute and Buildings and Cities. We have a truly international gathering with panelists and participants from all corners of the globe. In this webinar, we'll explore emerging practices that aim to make more room within the existing footprints of cities to promote densification while avoiding its pitfalls and confronting issues of local resistance. Densification, it turns out, is not so simple. Today, we'll learn lessons from densification efforts in South Africa, China, the United Kingdom, and Israel, and we'll discuss the merits and limitations of densification strategies in various urban settings. In terms of logistics, please use your Q&A function to ask questions of the panelists. We're going to reserve questions, Q&A, answer responses to the end. We're going to get to as many of your questions as you can during the session, but if there are questions that there are not time to, where there isn't enough time to respond to, all the questions along with answers to all of those will be distributed to everyone who registered for the session. We also want to make sure that all attendees are aware that the session today is being recorded. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Richard Lorch. Richard is an architect, researcher, writer, and editor-in-chief of Buildings and Cities. He was the former editor-in-chief of Building Research and Information and executive editor of Climate Policy. He's a visiting professor at University College London and Politecnico di Milano. He works on policy responses to climate change and on the environmental impacts of the built environment. Richard, we're grateful that you're here with us today. Thanks for taking the time. I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Let's see if I can get this going. Yeah. So thank you, Angela, and a warm welcome to this webinar, which is co-hosted by the Marron Institute and Buildings and Cities Journal. I'm the editor of Buildings and Cities. This peer-reviewed journal occupies a unique space in academic publishing. It provides a transdisciplinary approach to the built environment and focuses on the interplay between the different scales of the built environment: buildings, blocks, neighborhoods, cities, national building stocks, and infrastructure. Concurrent with this series of webinars is the publication of a special issue of the journal on urban densification. This special issue investigated the specific challenges, impacts, and fragilities that urban densification creates across different scales. So it is a real pleasure to collaborate with the Marron Institute, recognizing the expertise that they bring to this subject. The direct impacts of densification on Sustainable Development Goals and Habitat 3 are only beginning to be systematically measured and understood. The benefits and the costs of densification are not evenly distributed amongst the population. Unintended consequences of densification can reduce the affordability of housing and thereby cause displacement and increase the commuting distances. Some practices aimed at increasing density fail to deliver the intended results. Today's event will discuss how densification actually plays out in practice. It is vital for this to be evidenced and understood by policymakers and practitioners. I look forward to today's presentations and expect to hear who benefits, who loses, as well as some of the unintended consequences. Over the past year or more, it has been my pleasure to work with Jacques Teller, who guest edited this special issue, and to work with the many authors who contributed, some of whom are presenting here today. Jacques Teller is professor of urban planning at the University of Liège, where he is leading the Local Environment Management and Analysis Research Group. His main field of interest lies in sustainable and inclusive city. His research typically combines urban governance issues with the modeling of urbanization dynamics. Jacques will actually moderate the event. I'm just here to welcome you and introduce him. Jacques will now introduce the agenda for the webinar, the presentations and the discussant. Over to you, Jacques.
Thanks, Richard. I'm pleased to be here today with you for this new seminar on urban densification, and I would wish to thank the Marron Institute and Shlomo Angel for the invitation. I will rapidly present the different panelists today and make an introduction to the seminar. So we will have 6 panelists today. Shlomo Angel is professor of city planning at the Marron Institute and the director of its urban expansion program. Mina Sunika Balank is deputy head of department fellow of Churchill College and director of studies for Churchill College. Xing Li is PhD candidate funded by CSC Cambridge Trust, and her research is focused on urban densification and social capital. And she will be presenting a work she's been doing on neighborhood restructuring in China in collaboration with Mina Sunik Blank. Nicola Livingstone is associate professor at the Bartlett School of Planning, faculty of the Built Environment at the UCL. And he will speak about a practical case in London that has been developed for the building and cities spatial issues. Naomi Carmon is professor emerita of urban planning and sociology at the Israel Institute of Technology. And Nava Kainer-Persov is postdoctoral fellow at the University of Haifa and adjunct lecturer at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning Technion. They will both speak about experience in Israel about densification. Let me just take the room now for sharing the screen, and I will try to start the presentation. So this seminar will be mainly dedicated to urban densification practice, considering that the previous seminar from the Marron Institute already addressed issues related to the rationality of densification, why should we densify and where, and the measure of densification, which was the subject of the previous seminar. We know that there is a strong pressure on densification, and especially densification is increasingly accepted as a necessity and is crucial for the non-Atlantic policy. And I just mentioned the policy that has been adopted in 2011 by the European Commission that foresees that at European level, there should not be any more land take by 2050, which requires to redevelop and develop new buildings for new inhabitants within existing urbanized area. There are a number of still factors that imply resistance to densification. These resistant factors to densification may be related to socioeconomic issues, especially defending the rights of existing communities to maintain low density in order to preserve affordable housing or local workplaces. A number of the resistances are also related to environmental issues, especially protection of green areas included in already dense area, and the way to develop densification without consuming green areas that are vitally important for citizens, especially in very dense cities, and a number of also of morphological issues, for instance, the cadastral inertia and the difficulties in plot relocation for larger development. It's always easier to subdivide plots for developing and expanding urban areas than gathering existing and already built urban plots in order to develop more dense, more high-rise developments. As regards with these different factors, we should consider these factors according to different forms of densifications. And in the buildings and cities, special issue we paid special care not to idealize urban densification. We know indeed that in some cities, densification can take very extreme form. We have here an example of hard densification policies like in Bogota, where we can see that such policies may lead to very low living conditions, even when it's planned by local authorities and organized through normal regulatory processes. Besides these hard densification policies and their likely effects on living conditions. We can also observe in a number of cities that densification may operate through incremental addition to existing neighborhoods. We have here an example in Hanoi of Soviet blocks that densified through progressive extension and increase of the population living in these areas. Such incremental soft densification policies are not the monopoly of the global south, and it will be explained in the case of South Africa by Shlomo Angel later on during this seminar. We have also soft densification policies promoted in some countries in the global north, like for instance in the UK, where small additions to existing houses are now somehow deregulated to make them easier and to promote densification of the existing urban fabric. In the building and cities spatial issues, we addressed a number of factors to be considered as regard with urban densification, especially the effects of densifications as regard with energy consumption, air quality and urban microclimate, mobility, land use and biodiversity, housing affordability, as has been already stressed by Richard, economic attractiveness of cities, the relation between densification and attractiveness for cities, infrastructure costs, and the related cost of infrastructure when compared to housing density, the quality of life, privacy, access to services and facilities, social diversity and capital, and of course, urban health, which is an important topic now, especially since the COVID crisis that shed a crude light on possible and controversial relation between densification and density and the development of the pandemic in different conditions. All these factors may be considered and may have positive or negative relations with densification. It's the case for energy consumption, as for instance, there is a number of researches related to the impact of densification on lowering energy consumption at the building level, but also when buildings tend to be much higher scales, the embodied energy of some buildings tends to be much larger than smaller buildings. Besides the fact that these factors may be positive or negative, the causal chain is not always that clear. The relation between infrastructure cost and densification has been quite studied over the past, and it's been demonstrated that high density environment translated by lower infrastructure costs when they are related to inhabitants. On the opposite way, the presence of infrastructure may be a way to trigger densification, as it's been highlighted in some of the papers in the last in the special issue of building studies. And if I was to single out some of these effects today, I would say, as Richard Lorch already said, that a relation between urban densification and housing affordability is certainly a key issue to be considered in practice of densification. And I hope that some of the papers will address this issue, and we will come back to this discussion later on. And also we will have certainly discussion about the effect of urban densification on social practices. We will have today quite short presentation. We asked the panelists to keep within 10 minutes so as to leave enough room for discussions. And we will ask you to use the question and answer so as to feed the discussions. And we will wrap up all the questions and try to send them to the panelists at the end of the presentations. Thank you very much. And I will now leave the room to Mina, Sunika Blank, and Shinli, who will present the case of the neighborhood in China.
Thank you, Jacques. Xin, if you can share the screen and start the presentation. So thank you very much on our behalf for inviting us to this very interesting webinar series and give us an opportunity to present our work. So in our short presentation, we'll mainly say a few things about let's say, the unintended consequences of urban densification on social capital. And we'll focus on Jinan in China as a case study. So Xin, if you put the next slide. So we'll do the presentation show that I'll just give a very brief introduction to our framework and methodology, and then Xin elaborate on the findings. So what we have mainly been interested in is what happens in the urban regeneration project when households move from courtyard housing, what you see in this image, to high-rise, high-density housing typology. So Xin, if you put the next slide. That's the image on the right-hand side. So something which is very typical on Chinese urban regeneration, but very common typology also in other parts of the world. So what makes China a very interesting case study, I think, at this moment, is that the big, massive national relocation project is coming to an end in 2021. So there's a new approach or change in paradigm that regeneration would not be based anymore solely on demolition and rebuilding, but also renovation and gradual improvement of the neighborhoods by providing better insulation, lifts and services to the areas. Having said that, what always comes as a surprise to me is that in Chinese context, an older building is a building that has been built before 2000, so also relatively new housing stock, but there's a kind of acknowledgement that the regeneration would need to address also, let's say, kind of social community. And the other aspect, what we're very interested is how this all reflects on domestic energy demand. So in China, as like everywhere else as well, the domestic energy demand is gradually increasing despite the energy efficiency improvements. And yet the national policy is counting very much on kind of individual motivational instruments, so progressive energy pricing, for example, those kind of signals. But we thought like what is more useful is perhaps apply practice theory-based approaches to understand the changing set of expectation for household and what is actually seen as a kind of favorable lifestyle these days. So Xin, if you put the next slide. So the research is based on extensive field work, and actually Xin is talking to us today also still from China, where she's finalizing the last stage of the field work. So the paper that we published in Buildings and Cities focused on the first part of the work, where the field work was conducted in 2019. It mainly consisted of semi-structured interviews, and these, despite collecting qualitative data, we try to be very rigorous with the method. So all the interviews were transcribed and coded with NVivo. So if you put the next, that's Xin on the right-hand side doing the fieldwork, talking to the inhabitants. And then while we use the social practice theory as a kind of background, we combined that with literature from social capital. So we kind of made a distinction among the respondents between whether they were stayers or newcomers. So we categorized newcomers as people who moved to the area after the regeneration, and stayers were people who had lived in the area, for example, in courtyard housing before the regeneration. And we also looked at whether the interviewees were actually tenants or whether they were owner occupiers. And if you put the next slide. And before Xin will talk more elaborately about the results, just to highlight kind of what our theoretical framework was. So why we found the practice theory very useful is that if you look at this image, it has the two central boxes, material arrangements and practices, and that allowed to understand how the physical material arrangements, which inevitably change as a result of the urban densification process, how these material arrangements in different scales affect the residents' practices. So we looked at the neighborhood scale, then also building scale, and even household technology. And then when we look at the whole process between material arrangements and practices, how that is reflected in social interactions and therefore in social capital. So our main research questions in this paper were like, how have the everyday practices of the residents, like cleaning, eating, cooking, how have they changed as a result of the neighborhood restructuring? And then also, how do the changes in practices and social relations differ if we look at the stayers versus newcomers? So Xin, if you then just take over and talk about the results.
Yeah, thanks, Mina. And so I'll briefly go through the findings at two scales, the neighborhood scale and the building scale. At the neighborhood scale, the scale of the streets had changed and shopping facilities had become more concentrated and located further away. And the new street layout is designed to be much wider, but in fact is less used. The neighborhood public bathing houses disappeared and part of the stairs actually shifted from collective bathing to individual showering. So the cursory interactions between neighbors are thus reduced. At the building scale, before the restructuring for stairs, their daily activities such as cooking, eating, and hygiene took place in the central courtyard and actually took place outside. A key feature of living in such a courtyard typology as in the case study area is that residents can maintain a very close connection with their neighbors, meaning that more social interactions, especially informal ones, can take place in the neighborhood to build up mutual trust, which is one of the major effects of the social capital in a neighborhood context. As commented on by one stayer here, we wouldn't lose things even without closing the door. After the transition, these practices shifted from outdoors to indoors because the central courtyards disappeared. In the courtyard house, furniture was used kind of interchangeably and activities took place in a very flexible way. After transition to high-rises, residents' need for privacy have led to inner spaces for particular use. So this kind of a self-containment after transition to high-rises has increased privacy and reduced the neighborhood social relations gained by sharing facilities. Further, the spatial dispersion of practices after the restructuring is not only caused by the change in the housing topology, but is also a result of a changing culture in living, and moving from a collective form of living to more individualized practice performances. And finally, because a strong identity with the people and a sense of attachment to the area are mostly found in those long-term roots and locally extended families. So strong network, social network was formed by them. And in this network, stayers maintain very close relationship with each other. And it tends to exclude newcomers, especially tenants. And this is an outcome regarded as the dark side of the social capital. And this graph is not included in the paper we published, and because this is for a survey we conducted at a later stage to quantify the practices. And this survey was conducted between September and October 2020, and we have finally 201 valid copies at the end. And here it shows how practices changed among the stayers. People tend to have more appliances and spend more time indoors, and they tend to socialize less with neighbors, and children play less outdoors. And we have actually a separate graph for the newcomers, and the newcomers are generally dense energy users compared with the stayers or long-term residents, and heavily rely on central air conditioning. So both the stayers and newcomers, they all shifted to a more energy intensive lifestyle and more indoor lifestyle. But I won't spend too much time on this slide for today. Just a brief summary here. This study focuses on the social impacts of the changes in the material arrangements that are driven by urban densification in China. It shows how the decisions made at the neighborhood level are reflected in changes in residents' daily practices and their notions of privacy, which is research question 1 here, revealing a decline in the neighborhood's social relations and the division between stayers and newcomers, which is research question 2 here, and underlying the importance of social sustainability when planning urban restructuring projects in China. So as explained in the paper, on the one hand, we admit that the restructuring project in Weijiazhuang in this neighborhood in China has benefited the residents a lot in terms of the physical improvement of the housing quality. On the other hand, we believe that there are unintended social consequences that need to be paid attention to. For example, it was found that there has been general decline on the neighborhood social relations at different scales. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mina and Shin. I will now give the floor to Shlomo Angel, who will rapidly present the case of Anne Bernstein, who could not be with us today.
Thank you, Jacques. I'm afraid that Anne is not going to be with us today. She's fallen sick. Anne Bernstein is the executive director of the Center for Development and Enterprise in South Africa. And she's been doing some very powerful work on trying to change government policy in South Africa that pertains to housing and urban development to be more realistic and more inclusive. The current housing and urban development policies delivered millions of units at rates that experts agree is much better than public housing program in most other countries. However, South Africa's approach of building houses that are often far away from centers of economic activity, with limited access to decent schools and functional infrastructure, has actually reinforced apartheid spatial patterns and contributed to the current high unemployment rate. Many poor people who live in these more remote settlements cannot afford transport costs, even to share for jobs. The commitment to providing fully subsidized free housing in South Africa means that the government needed to access enormous amounts of undeveloped land for housing projects. Generally, such land was located on the outskirts of cities or towns with population growth and rapid urbanization. This is no longer a viable and affordable strategy. Professor Hausman at Harvard has argued that people who look at housing as housing units fail to see that housing is actually part of a larger network. It's not an object, it's a habitat with a multiplicity of overlapping networks, whether it's power, water, sanitation, roads, transport, labor markets, retail, entertainment, education. We just saw in Jean Lee's presentation that streets that used to be full of activity, full of industry, full of retail have been eliminated with the turn to towers in the park. Anyway, these networks make up all the benefits of agglomeration in cities that make them effective at generating opportunities for low-income households. Compare this with an approach that creates generally segregated poor neighborhoods where mainly unemployed, unskilled people live among themselves, disconnected from others, all of which makes it harder for them to benefit from connected urban economies. It's time to think differently, Anne says. An enormous opportunity exists in the densification of existing suburbs using what has been called a massive small approach. This refers to a process whereby poor households and small private developers densify existing residential neighborhoods by creating multi-unit rental dwellings and building additional low-cost rental accommodation in backyard. I'm sharing the screen for you to see one example of that. Let me see. I'm sorry, it's disappeared. So, sorry, stop sharing. I'll get to that later. Anyway, this bottoms-up market-driven approach is gaining traction across South African metros. It is clear that South Africans want to live in well-located parts of the cities where jobs and economic opportunities are concentrated. They're prepared to substitute long and costly commutes and pay affordable rents for relatively small spaces if this means that housing is well situated. To accommodate this demand, small-scale entrepreneurs are responding by developing relatively cheap, mainly rental options in a dispersed way, all close to transport corridors, economic nodes, and city centers and job opportunities. These are some of the areas where these developments are taking place. I'll show a picture later. There's a mushrooming process of homeowners, landlords, small developers, building properties close to urban economic opportunities, mainly to let. The potential of this approach is huge. There are currently 4.5 million freestanding, privately owned houses in urban residential areas across South Africa, with tremendous potential for densification. If this becomes an increasingly prominent mode for producing low-cost new housing options for the poor, we could reduce the demand for new land in the metros over the next 25 years by around 70%. At the same time, we would be creating more efficient, productive, and inclusive cities and providing vastly more opportunities to the poor in well-located areas. Can a massive small densification and expansion of habitats for poorer people be taken to scale? Many of these private, bottom-of-the-market developers finance their own construction using a second mortgage, savings, unsecured personal loans, or by turning to local informal lenders. Some new finance providers have emerged, including platforms such as iBuild, BeepTrop, and so on. The pioneer in this field is TUHF Group, which has been operating for 17 years within all 8 metros. They've given out housing entrepreneurs an estimated 4.7 billion rands in total funding. Moreover, these investments supported have contributed significantly to local economic development. The challenge is that both municipalities and established banks are failing to tailor their regulations and services to the reality of massive small developers. High compliance burdens, the lack of necessary long-term development finance, and inadequate infrastructure are combining to undermine the emergence of quality rental units at the largest scale. The Center for Development of an Enterprise proposal include metros becoming more focused and more able to manage this phenomenon, reduce development contributions and fees, ensure that infrastructure is upgraded and affordable, and receive more financial support from national government to manage densification. Regulations should strike the appropriate balance between making compliance easy to achieve for developers while protecting tenants. Funding should not be directed towards individual households, and developers in the form of subsidies should come from new institutions and established private funders in a ways that will accelerate the massive small approach. To make this happen, metros need to strengthen their current policy position on densification and backyard renters. They should identify and focus on areas where residential densification will benefit home seekers in the city. They need to introduce appropriate, streamlined compliance requirements, expand infrastructure in areas that are targeted for these kinds of development, and strengthen their management capabilities. Similarly, the national government needs to enable these developments in various ways. Businesses and big banks also have a big role to play. In conclusion, Anne says, South Africa must move away from apartheid-style cities with the poorest people having to live far away from economic opportunities. This is contributing to the scale of unemployment, preventing our cities from linking job seekers and employers in an efficient way, and keeping many people mired in poverty or dependent on social transfers. Densification is already happening within existing residential areas, and the best thing to do is to enable this to happen at a much greater scale and in an optimal way. We must ensure that these areas develop into thriving, productive neighborhoods rather than urban slums. It is in the context of mass unemployment, extreme fiscal constraints, and the devastation brought about by COVID-19 pandemic, government needs to ride this wave and encourage and enable the private-led developments already taking place. The Center for Development and Enterprise believes that while ownership is important and should always be an option, for many poor people, location trumps ownership. It is usually far better to rent a property in Orange Grove than to own a house in Orange Farm. Across the country, private entrepreneurs are providing relatively cheap housing options in well-located neighborhoods through a multitude of small and medium-scale projects. These housing options could be multiplied further and at far better quality if they were enabled by government, especially metropolitan government, and if they were able to gain better access to finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Solly, for summarizing the presentation of Anne Bernstein, who could not be with us. And I think it's a great example as compared with the situation of Jinan of soft densification policy supported by the state and its implication in terms of infrastructure and development.
Excuse me, Jacques, just one more second. I would like to, if possible, to share my screen.
Yes, sure.
I don't see a share screen here. Yeah, just to show one picture of what is happening. So on the left, you see kind of an added rental unit. And on the right, you can see in the back here, units that were built in the backyards of suburban homes. That's just an example from Anne's paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I will now give the floor. Naomi and Nava, please take the floor, and I invite you to make the presentation of.
Okay, let me share. Okay.
Thank you.
Can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so
Shalom.
please.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Shalom
Yes, we
to
can.
Yes.
everyone. Shalom is the Hebrew word for peace, and salam is the Arabic word for peace. And if you've seen the international media yesterday and today, you can realize that having peace is always important, especially these days. So again, shalom to everybody here. My name is Naomi Carmon, as you can see on screen, and I've been teaching and studying and also consulting issues of urban regeneration, urban renewal, urban densification for the last 50 years or so, mainly in Israel, but also in other parts of the world. Today, we're going, Nava, can you? Okay. Israel has a long history of urban densification. The first phase is actually similar to what Jacques was talking about and called it soft, as we do, soft densification, small-scale residential projects, most common in one multi-unit building, 2 to 8 floors. The process is usually motivated by the wish of individual households to improve their quality of life. And we're talking about enlargements of apartments and buildings in low and middle income neighborhoods. Actually, it's divided into 2 stages. This long stage of soft densification is divided into 2 stages. In the first one, the involvement of the authorities, of the government, of the municipality was minimal, except of some very soft regulation. In the second phase, project renewal, a kind of urban renewal program, national one, entered the scene and secured also some loans, not grants, and technical assistance, but still supported a very gradual process of kind of self-help updating. We're not talking about self-help of developing countries, people doing with their own hands, but self-help by what we mean is making all the residents are making all the decisions. They decide who plans, who builds, who make all the arrangements around their houses. And this way, a large share of the small housing units that were built around the country in the first 30 years of independence were enlarged. And we go to the second phase, or we have here a nice example in a Jewish Arab neighborhood in Akko in Israel, Acre. You see the before, you see the after, and you can see in yellow the floor plan enlargement that made a real change. You have here 4 apartments in 1 floor and the enlargements. Can you? Okay, phase 2. Intensive densification. That's in the new millennium. Urban densification is at the top of the government housing agenda. Unlike the first 50 years, now in recent 20 years, it's up on the agenda because the government realized we have to build so many new houses and we don't want to take all the open land of the country for that. It's a small country. So densification is the preferred solution. Resilience requirements were added, strengthening the buildings against earthquakes and building shelter rooms in each dwelling. It's especially needed in Israel, but as you know, it's needed around the world in some way or other resilience requirements. And all that is expected to happen with private market alone responsible for financing and execution. There is a general framework of public regulation and some master plans, but on the whole, it's private market. There are 2 major outline plans, demolition and redevelopment. That's a kind of aggressive, in our words, densification, and a softer kind of Tama 38. I have here 2 illustrations. This is demolition and redevelopment, and the other one is Tama. You can see Tama 38 before and after. We are going to concentrate on this kind of program, and the floor is yours, Nava, to continue.
Thank you, Nomi. So Tama 38 is really more like a medium-sized densification plan compared to the demolition and reconstruction that Nomi just showed. Tama 38 is a national plan for reinforcement of existing buildings in Israel. Here we can see the Tama in the developer's eyes, in a way kind of a villa in the park. But in reality, as we go on, we can see the Tama in the urban fabric as it looks like. So I'm going to concentrate today very shortly on a case study in Ramat Gan city, which called Negba area. Ramat Gan is very vibrant regarding Tama 38, only second to Tel Aviv. And this one is a part of a larger research, part of my PhD dissertation regarding housing regeneration strategies and their evaluation from the social justice point of view. So I'll start that the first years when the Tama 38 was initiated in 2005, the local municipalities didn't really know what to do with this national plan, and they just created a uniform planning layer for the whole city. after a building started to be built in certain areas, and this is the Negba area, municipalities started to understand that they need to do something else because they couldn't really realize to have all of those housing units in as one uniform layer on the whole city. And they started to create special urban regeneration master plan that will reflect the different areas of the city. And this is the area that we have learned. This is an ex-post evaluation research, part of the larger research where we interviewed almost 100 households in Tama 38 and in the demolition and development. But in the Negba area, those are the buildings that we have interviewed the residents. You can see that those buildings were not demolished, but I think that this building here examples it the best in the Hassar Moshe. You can see the first 3 stories, which are the original existing buildings. And on top of it, you can see the new floors. If you will take a closer look at each photo, you can see it really easy as you walk on the street in Israel. So we have interviewed local residents, long-time residents and new residents, as well as architects, developers, lawyers, and city representatives. So I'll go to some very quick findings from this research. And the first perspective will be of the long-time residents. We have to keep in mind that the urban regeneration programs in Israel since the 2000s are actually an economic deal between developer and homeowners. So in this case, the homeowners give the developer or sell the developer their building rights, and in exchange, they receive to their own apartment, they receive an additional room that is called a sheltered room, a mamad in Israel, which in those days is really important. So here is an illustration of the existing apartment, a sheltered room, and as well as an open balcony. And some of them receive also private storage. In other cases, it may be for the whole residents in the building. More than that, the developer renovate the staircase of the building, add an elevator if they do not have an elevator in their building, a new lobby, as you can see here in the photo, refurbished the exterior of the building and other amenities like sprinkler systems, and more. Most of the residents are really very satisfied with this project. One of the residents told us they are kind of an elderly resident that they could not stay in the building if they didn't have the elevator, since they had to climb up 4 floors. So this was really helpful for those people that lived there for many years to stay in the same place. Of course, there were also obstacles since the residents still live at the building while construction is taking place. And they told us about the noise, the dust, the different people that come in and out, and even sometimes burglary that happens in the building. Now I'll move to the new residents, and one of our interesting findings was that the new residents in the Tama building are actually long-time residents in the neighborhood. 63% of the people that we have interviewed told us that they live on the same street or the same area. And then one of them said that she lived in the next building, and she saw the Tama building growing up from her window, and she wished that one day she will move in, and they actually did that, and they were so happy about it. They could stay in the same neighborhood, same friends, same workplace, school for the kids, and more. However, from the city point of view, the city realized that there is a problem with the carrying capacity of the different areas. And more than that, part of the incentives given to Tama 38 some municipal taxes are being viewed. So the municipality have some budget shortage in order, with all the new residents coming in to provide them all the public services. And I will end this case study about Tama 38 with another thing that we found out, that if in the city we have an old apartment in old building, and most of the times are small apartments, or on the other hand, you can see here the new apartment in new building, Tama 38 give us kind of a steps of more affordable housing in the city. So we have an old and enlarged apartment, we have a renovated apartment, and as well as a new apartment in Tama 38 that gives much more opportunities to different homeowners to come and stay in the center of the city. Nomi, now it's your turn.
And I would like to conclude our presentation by saying that we need various strategies for different cities with diverse populations, with a diverse forecast for population growth, real estate markets, and cultural groups. Our analysis of the Israeli case introduced two non-aggressive strategies that we put an emphasis on. We did not talk about the demolition and redevelopment that we also have. One is the organic soft strategy, dwelling by dwelling, building by building, households added rooms on the ground and on roofs according to needs and changing capabilities, all that within the boundaries of their lots. First, it was a kind of spontaneous process in low-rise buildings, and later encouraged and guided by the authorities in higher buildings, up to 8 and 12 floors. This kind of process, of soft process, is considered normal in developing countries. And we have seen various examples when other people talked here. But I say that it is required also in developed countries, certainly for small towns with no growth forecast, but also for the cause of diversity in larger cities. Here you have an example of this kind of soft densification before and after in a small town of moderate income households, not far away from the center of the country. The second soft strategy we presented is densification without demolition of the old buildings, style of Tama 38. Its implementation differs according to the real estate values in the area. It differs between hot demand areas and low demand areas. In hot demand areas, the economic forces are so strong that the process can work with no public money. However, in order to avoid harms, as we have seen in Israel, it needs public regulation, not public money, but public regulation. General guidelines by the government authorities, plus a policy document of the municipality considering the carrying capacity of different neighborhoods. The story is very different in low demand areas. There, the economic forces are so low that planners and other stakeholders should enact and synergize special tools of 5 fields: planning, engineering, financing. Financing means pulling public, private, and third sector resources social communal tools, and administrative managerial. We have no time to talk about a big research that we are currently working on in Israel, but we are in process of trying these, not only studying, but also trying them in the field, and have first indication that it works, or that in this way it can work also in low demand areas. Here we have several examples of Tama 38, before and after, before and after. And we move on to the excellent causes for non-aggressive densification strategies, such as the ones we presented. Causes are socioeconomic, moderating the trend of rising housing prices that we talked about beforehand, that usually accompany aggressive densification, such as demolition and redevelopment, and also curbing common displacement of the poor, or at least the less affluent residents of the city. We have cultural reasons, conserving unique modes of life in this city. We want this variability, cultural variability in the city. We have environmental reasons, saving the enormous waste of material that results from demolishing old buildings, and from constructing buildings from scratch. And last but not least, encouraging diversity. We want to encourage diversity and avoid uniformity. Nava, can you show the picture from West Berlin for a minute?
Yes.
It's behind that. Yeah. This is the kind of blocks from East Berlin that were discovered after the fall of the wall in 88. It's not what we want. We want the densification, but not this kind of. And let's go back to the last. No, here we are. So, no, beforehand. I would like to end by saying that it's desirable and possible to enhance all these good causes by educated implementation, and we have knowledge about implementation of non-aggressive densification strategies. Thank you for listening.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Naomi and Nava. A very fascinating example of soft densification regulated and incentivized by public authorities. I hope now that Nicola has once again joined us and she can make her presentation. Hi, it's working now. Nicola, you have the floor.
This is great. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks very much to Jacques and Shlomo for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is a recently published paper that appeared in the Building and City special issue entitled Planning for Residential Value, Urban Densification Policies and Real Estate Impacts in London. So hopefully second time round, we'll have no problems. And you'd think after the last year that we would all be pros at Zoom by now, but clearly not. So I'd like to introduce this paper that was co-authored with my colleague Michael Short, who's also at the Bartlett School of Planning with me in London, and also our colleague Stefania Fiorentino, who is at the University of Cambridge. So as co-authors, we wanted to consider density as a research concept from a variety of different perspectives, unpack its meaning and its impacts a little bit more from Michael's work, which looks at sustainability, heritage, and building height, combined with Stefania's interest in urban economics and planning, and my own background, which is more about real estate development and investment and a broader kind of take on urban studies. So our research agenda kind of connects multidisciplinary perspectives on density, and we wanted to work on some overarching questions for consideration to try and enhance our knowledge about how urban environments are decreated and recreated and how cities are transformed through densification. So we thought about whether or not we could better understand urban density by considering it in a qualitative way, in more of a relational, subjective and dynamic way. We also wondered what makes densification processes more or less successful in various contexts. We wondered if urban densification was mediating experiences of housing crisis. And we also kind of thought more broadly, who is density for? So can we unpack ideas around value and density in cities? And that's where the title of our paper comes from. So we do see challenges that are constantly materializing from myriad interconnected influences on density across cities. And these are stimulating various and very different responses with subjective impacts. And I think we've heard so far how these impacts have been manifest across global cities today. So one similarity that emerges from global cities such as London, New York, and Toronto, as well as others, is the uneven experience of housing and the experience of housing crisis under neoliberalism. So there are issues of affordability, and residential property is undergoing processes of financialization, and space is seen to be at a premium. So what we wanted to do in our paper was to consider the agency and the influence of planning processes on how density is manifest in the urban form. So we suggest that urban transformation through densification can bring opportunities for real estate development, combined with longer term investment and financial gains for local authorities. However, the measurements and indicators that we use to define density and its impacts could potentially be better understood both objectively and subjectively through an extended notion of value. So what we seek to do in this paper is evaluate the idea of value by exploring ongoing densification processes through a detailed case study of 9 elms in London. So we wonder how and for whom is value created through planning for densification. So a little bit of context on 9 elms then. This type of massive regeneration project reflects a hard, large-scale approach to densification and responds to calls for realizing the growth potential in London through collaboration and the support for wider regeneration. So it seeks to optimize residential and non-residential densities. And the Vauxhall 9 Elms and Battersea Opportunity Area covers over 200 hectares for development. It is the largest opportunity area across London. And opportunity areas are London's major source of brownfield land, which are seen to have significant capacity for development. And they also have got existing or potentially improved public transport access. So Vauxhall 9 Elms is just in the immediate southwest of the Thames in a very prime city central location in London. And these opportunity areas were introduced by the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, in the London Plan in 2004. And there are now 38 of these across the city. So the opportunity area for Vauxhall and 9 Elms spans over 200 hectares and has an indicative employment capacity of 25,000 people with a minimum housing target of 20,000 units. So this actually has increased from 16,000 units initially. So latest figures indicate that between 2015 and 2020, there were almost 5,000 residential units built in the area, and there are almost 5,000 further units that are currently under construction. So this opportunity area straddles 2 local boroughs in London. It is Wandsworth to the south and Lambeth to the north, and this introduces some additional complexities when we're understanding local strategies towards housing affordability and densification. So we wonder about these bigger questions that are relating to the housing market. So who is the development for? What do these opportunity area targets tell us? Are they successful in practice? Do they meet the needs of local communities? And how affordable are they? So at the minute, this is very much an ongoing development. They anticipate that the opportunity area will have a development lifespan of around 25 years. So we're kind of midway through the development as it is. And we'll look shortly at some pictures that demonstrate the process and the densification practices that are at play. So density is mostly perceived as a way to address the local housing crisis and to uplift land values in relation to public transport provision. And our new London plan, which was just finally released earlier this year after a little bit of delay, reflects how density should be optimized rather than maximized across London. And it shouldn't be approached mechanistically, provided it sits within a particular local context. So the UK has got a discretionary planning system where each local planning authority can interpret the concept of density in different ways, depending on particular measurements and subjective understandings and the local contexts that they're dealing with. So local authorities as well are also able to capture value from developments through what's known as planning gain in the UK. And each planning application is decided on a case-by-case basis and is often the result of a lot of negotiation between the local authority planners and the developers and investors. So Section 106 and CIL, the Community Infrastructure Levy, are ways in which planning gain is captured by the local authorities in London and which is then taken from the developers and redistributed through the local authorities to the benefit of the wider community. So typically, if you're contributing Section 106 contributions to the local authority as a developer, these contributions become a key source of affordable housing units across that local authority, in theory. And in general, the larger the development, the greater the contribution towards affordable housing will be. So in theory, if we think about hard densification, the bigger the scale, the more contribution towards the local authority. So the contributions are typically redistributed through the local community and into things like affordable housing, but also education, open space, and additional infrastructure and transport. So in addition to density and housing policies, the latest Wandsworth Local Plan Core Strategy, so again, another policy, adopted in 2016, sets boundaries within the opportunity area for areas of low density as well. So it does want to protect some small businesses and industrial activities in the area because the area historically was very industrial. So there are a number of potentially opposing forces at play here, and there's clearly a need from the perspective of the two boroughs to kind of counteract potential detriments in favour of overall benefits of this type of large-scale regeneration and redevelopment. So this is the Vauxhall, Nine Elms and Battersea opportunity area. This is what it used to look like. And you can see you've got the iconic Battersea Power Station in the middle of the photograph and what is an awful lot of industrial land use surrounding it. This is what they anticipate the completed development to look like. So again, you can see Battersea Power Station, which has been preserved and renovated. You can also see at the very top on the right-hand side of the photograph, clusters, high-rise towers in the north of the development towards Vauxhall, and they're up to around 200 metres in height. There's more medium-sized density around the Battersea Power Station, so these are up to kind of 60 metres in height. However, I suppose the idea of medium rise is quite relative. If we look at the difference in height between the new development in Nine Elms and compare those with the development on the bottom right, which is the existing housing in the area. So although the opportunity area planning framework is aiming to create a prestigious destination for international investors, anchored by the rejuvenated Battersea Power Station and the new United States Embassy, which you can see just south of the towers there, It also recognises this need to upgrade local amenities because there are high levels of social deprivation around this opportunity area as well. So again, it's about the pros and cons and the potential impacts for everybody involved in this local community. So what has happened so far and what have the responses to this development been? You'll see in this slide a variety of different reflections on the progress of the development from newspapers. And in 2012, Rowan Moore, who writes for The Guardian and The Observer, questioned the creation of this opportunity area as being a utopia on Thames. Our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, calls it the greatest transformational story in the world's greatest city. You know, there's an awful lot of hyperbole going on around this development. However, Donald Trump did think that the new location for the United States Embassy was lousy, apparently. Some might agree. Maybe agree with them in some things, but not others. So there's also been issues around who this development is for and who is buying these flats. So in 2015, we saw that Julia Collieu, again in The Guardian, was saying, you know, this is creating an enclave for wealthy international investors. It's luxury flats. It's for foreign buyers who can afford this in the local community. And again, more recently, Oliver Wainwright wrote the long read in The Guardian, talking about how Europe's biggest regeneration project fell flat. So he suggests that there's a creation of an exclusive fiefdom in the area, and that we're seeing the result of politicians being in thrall to property developers and being led entirely by the market rather than by the planning system and local need. And you'll see in that picture in the top left, this is the world's first swimming pool bridge that connects two of the developments, the luxury developments in Battersea. But I think what sums it up quite nicely for me is this picture on the bottom right, where you can see a billboard hoarding around the construction sites, where clearly they're advertising it as work, shop and play. You know, it's a vibrant district. We're creating something very new here. However, somebody had gone around and got rid of all the L's in play so that it reads work, shop and pay. So there's clearly some level of discontent with the nature of this development. And whoever had done this had actually gone along and taken out the L from all the hoardings that I walked past. So it was a bit of an effort to make quite a clear point that they were not very happy with the change in the area. So what do we see as kind of the outcomes? So these are three pinch points, really, I suppose, that we wanted to consider in relation to planning and real estate, and potential areas, I suppose, for conflict in relation to densification in practice and the emerging impacts of this development within the London context. So temporalities, as well as the scale of development, clearly have an influential role to play in considering how developments proceed and what their emerging impacts are, especially when we're managing growth in times of demand and crisis in the housing market, but also certainly in the last year with all the impacts of COVID that are emerging as well. Apparently, around 800,000 people have moved out of London since the COVID pandemic hit. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens to the development in the coming years. So we may see what Colin McFarlane refers to as densification, re-densification, and potentially de-densification happening. You do have to wonder in relation to the power dynamics and inequalities where the local community fits in. How have these communities been sort of considered in the development process, and where do the power dynamics lie? So with the deregulation of the planning system and the fact that the planning system is discretionary and based on local authority interpretation and negotiation, have we got an over-reliance on a market-led system for development? And we also wonder as well about the local planning authority's capacity to extract value from developers through these Section 106 and community infrastructure levy contributions. So are these really going towards creating affordable housing? I would have gone into a little bit more detail in that, but suffice to say that in line with the affordable housing, what some developers said they would provide initially has adjusted since the development has started. So for example, of the 4,239 homes that are being provided in Battersea Power Station, only 386 of those are going to be affordable. And this is around half of what they had originally committed to. So there are a lot of tensions and issues. And as always, we've got emerging conclusions, but from these emerging conclusions, we have further questions that we'd like to consider moving forward. But we wonder about the system and how the planning system could potentially respond more proactively to the creation of value, and these ideas about optimizing rather than maximizing density. So what is intelligent density, as density for some is not clearly beneficial to everybody? We do see issues with community engagement that we'd like to unpack a little bit more, as well as residents' experiences as well. But really, when we think about drawing back to ideas about value, so we have clear subjectivities of value through density in this development, how it's perceived, how it can be understood, and how it should be accounted for throughout the entire life of a development. So there needs to be more open lines of communication across the spectrum of actors involved, and better connections, I suppose, between those people that are involved. So it's about, I think, revisiting and rethinking approaches to ensure that this substantial level of density and densification processes have got positive impacts overall and does create value across the communities. And that was a little bit of a quick whistle-stop tour, but there's a little bit more info on there if you'd like to learn anything else about what we've been writing about. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for this presentation on the case of London. I'm happy that you managed to fix your presentation. And I will now give the floor to Shlomo, who will make a reading of the different presentations before we start the discussion.
Thank you, Jacques. These presentations that we heard today, from China, South Africa, Israel, and England, complement each other in interesting ways. The thing that comes up first with the Chinese presentation, for example, is that densification leads to changes in the way of life. This has been happening in Hong Kong for decades. The Chinese used to live on the ground in courtyard houses, and they are now, more and more of them are living in high-rise buildings. One of the questions it raises is, are these high-rise buildings actually denser than urban villages? Sometimes they aren't. And so we're not getting densification, we're just getting modernization of the housing stock. And that kind of divorces housing from other activities. And we heard even from Nicola that the idea of wanting to preserve some other activities. So for example, when we look at Dharavi, the largest slum in Mumbai, as a housing stock, we miss out on all the commercial activities, the industrial activities, the educational activities that are going on there. So the high-rise idea of densification ignores what really happens in communities. The second thing that comes to mind is displacement. And I think that in that case, both the South African and the Israeli case are highlighted in that they do not create displacement, which is very much to be celebrated, because a lot of these value creation, as Nicola called them, projects that have to do with demolition and rebuilding, get rid of the resident population, and has created a lot of damage in the process. On the Nicola thing in England, I want to point out that these big development projects that are very much guided by capitalist finance could not proceed without government collaboration. Government is critical in making these projects possible, and government doesn't understand enough about value and doesn't understand how much value can be taken from development, not to mention individual citizens that understand very little about value. I personally have tried to go into slum areas and talk about value and talk to them about this slum being a piece of real estate and what they can do with it. The one final comment that I want to make about densification, which is common to many of these projects, is this idea of densifying these apartment buildings that are built as towers in the park with a lot of open space between them that is not really properly used. I remember the Khrushchev era apartments in Russian cities, for example, that are walk-up buildings with dead space all around them, and could be densified by building in between and by adding stories to them that would make everybody better off, much as the Israeli case shows that there's 100% satisfaction among residents with this kind of densification. It's interesting in the Israeli case to note that when the government wants to have the private sector do all the work, it has to adjust its laws and regulations to make it happen. So that in the initial stages of this Tama 38, there was no response from the private sector. And gradually government changed rules, changed regulations, allowed that, opened that to make that happen. So government has a very critical role in promoting, allowing, accelerating densification. And I think these presentations begin to explain to government, particularly to municipal government, how they could both manage and encourage densification. And with that, I turn it back to Jacques.
Thank you very much, Soli, for this synthesis of the different presentations. I will have 2 or 3 questions for the different panelists. And I will basically make these questions open to all panelists, and I will try to open the discussion for some of them. The first discussion that emerged from the question and answer is related to the carrying capacity. This question has been raised both for the Tama case study, but we can also raise this question for the London case study. How do the city define carrying capacity, especially in soft densification projects? How do we cope for increased requirements in terms of parkings, but not only parkings, in terms of education, health, provision of green areas, and what is the impact of these densification projects and micro-densification projects as one shown in Israel on the microclimate. So maybe Naomi, you can react on this, and maybe Nicola also. How do we measure the carrying capacity for densification, both for soft and hard densification projects?
I'll try. First, much of this process happened in areas that several decades ago were more dense than now, because many of the families that lived in the central city left for the suburban areas, and actually there is room in the street, or less so in the streets, but in schools, in clinics, in all kinds of other social and public services. Usually the main problem is the roads, which means having much more cars, and parking, both of them. Israel is in a process of trying to convince its residents to use less of private transportation and to use more of public transportation. No successes yet, but actually this kind of densification is part of the idea of, in a way, enforcing people either not to have private cars or not to use them on the weekdays, just on weekends. But the transportation problem is not solved. It makes it harder and harder to have this kind of soft process. And actually, this is why there is a decision to stop TAMA 38 in the way it's implemented now, until, not completely, but until there is a municipality policy document for every neighborhood, trying to see what is the maximum capacity of each place in order to regulate the process that was not regulated enough until now.
Okay.
So
Thank
it's
you.
only partly solved.
I think also on the question and answer, some people are asking also about invisible infrastructure like sewage and the way to carry with these invisible infrastructure in the relation to densification. Maybe Nicola, about the carrying capacity. How do we measure the carrying capacity of an area like the one you've been analyzing in London? How do we define it in collaboration with local inhabitants?
I think it's very difficult and it's very complex. And I think what I presented was, more of a connection between what happens in terms of regulation and the planning process and the outcomes in terms of density. I think in terms of the experience of the people that are actually living in that area and the impact of that development is something that we're not going to be able to really qualify or understand for at least another 5 or 10 years, until the development is embedded and until, everything is almost getting towards completion. I mean, certainly the way that the governance mechanisms operate in London, with the vast number of opportunity areas that there are out there, there has been a drive towards density, and a lot of the planning permissions that have been given to larger scale developments. If you look at the guidelines in the previous London plan, where we had maximum caps on density, a lot of these were negotiated away and a lot of them were ignored. So you have to kind of question the effectiveness of the policies and the effectiveness of the value capture in local areas as well, whether or not the market is potentially too domineering, and how then this can potentially feed into everyday experiences and the complexities in terms of when the capital comes into the local authorities, what happens to it, where does it go? And as well as the hard densification processes, there is a lot of soft densification in London. And Michael and I actually wrote about a project in Victoria as the Victoria Opportunity Area. There's a lot of softer infill that is going on there. And I think that you can't really underestimate the positive impact of those types of densification processes. But that really, I think people do concentrate on the larger processes purely because they're more visible and they're more obvious. And in some ways you would expect that the impacts, especially the positive impacts, to be greater with these types of larger scale projects than with the softer, more discrete projects as well. But it's a very difficult question to answer. I'm not really sure it has an answer at this stage.
Good. Thank you for
the answer. I would like to add a word to say that there is an expectation that new technologies are going to solve, at least to some extent, or maybe there are others who say to a large extent, much of these problems. We are on the threshold of absorbing the new automated cars. Actually, next year we are expecting in Tel Aviv to have a taxi service without drivers. So we are on the verge of having some technological changes, also some new methods of drainage, of sewage that may solve some of the problems that are now being seen as unsolvable.
Thank you. Thank you for this. A question now for the presentation of Mina and Xin. We had quite a number of questions about your presentation, especially regarding the density of the space you are analyzing. One of the person asked, what is the balance when you ponder the increased build space by person that you observe in China and the densification of buildings? I mean, the increased number of housing and floor meter square. How do population density increase or decrease as regard with traditional urban settlements? Is the densification much higher in new developments as compared to traditional settlements when considering the increased build space by person? And another question was related to how to continue the work on social capital. What other indicators, aspects would you consider in social capital? Would you address issues like crime rate and so on?
Thank you, Jacques. Xin, do you want to answer to that? Maybe you can give some numbers about the inhabitants in the new tower blocks, because we didn't touch upon that.
Yes, thanks for the question. And in this case study area, the plot ratio before restructuring was only 0.28. And after restructuring, the ratio has reached 3.0. So you see how densely this area has become, and it has increased significantly. But in some, so this is the case for Jinan only. But I believe there are cases, for example, in Beijing or Shanghai, there are a number of cases showing the increase is not so obvious. Like Solly just commented, so we see a vertical or an upward trend, but in terms of the number, it doesn't increase so obvious or so significantly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mina, maybe on social capital.
Yeah, maybe on the social capital, I think there was also a question about what we mean by dark side of social capital. So yes, that in this case quite simply meant like the exclusion of others. So for example, the links between the stayers might be so strong, and that increases in a way the prejudices to exclude others, for example, renters. And this manifests like physically in China, the surprising number of gated communities, despite being a kind of safe and egalitarian society in its way. And also in our study, because the Chinese government has a policy of opening up the gates, so they could actually use the private road networks. But actually, when you talk to residents, they are not excited about it at all. They would prefer actually to have the gates in place, which I think gives a kind of warning example of creating lived experience in the cities that excludes other parts of the population, and kind of emphasizes the mixed use, both in a physical form, that it can be a mix of different kind of building heights and typologies, and also different demographics. That's incredibly important.
Thank you. Can I make a last question, Sonny?
Sorry, I just want to just a few words following that. For the audience who asked this question about social capital, I have a very good. I think I have very interesting paper. I will type the paper in the Q&A box. It's written by Mauricio Rubio. I sorry for the pronunciation. It's titled Perverse Social Capital, but I will double check with the reference name, and I will put the name in the box. It shows some evidence from Colombia about the social capital issue. I think that would be relevant.
Thank you for this answer. Sorry, I think we have to close the meeting now, or can I have a last question?
I totally agree. I want to thank all the participants, and including Richard and Angela for hosting it. And I think that this, for me, is a learning experience. I really like to learn from people who are doing work on the ground. rather than just sitting in ivory towers. So I'm basically very happy that we could start to begin to understand what it means to densify, rather than just kind of saying that density is good for climate change and leaving it at that. And if it doubled, it would be wonderful. But we can see how difficult it is to get densities to double, and what we need to know in order to make any progress in densification without creating more problems along the way. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Jacques for hosting it and for editing the special issue on densification. I think buildings and cities should become the go-to place for work on density and densification. So I encourage more work on that. And I just wanted to tell you that the fourth webinar on the anatomy of density will take place on June 10, and it will talk about densification strategies for New York City's next mayor. And so the same ideas that we heard today being applied in these different cities, we're going to see how appropriate they are for New York City, and I urge you all to attend. Thank you very much for attending. As we said before, we will answer all the questions in writing, and we'll send you the videos and the answers soon. Thank you.